Tobias, we prepared a picture. I would actually like to start with this photo. So, professors, could you explain a bit what's going on in this photo?
Well, it looks like Olivier is happy and understanding that he and Danny have had a terrific insight. It looks like Danny is happy with his insight, which is not always the case. Often he has an insight and then realizes he has a better insight. But right now he's in the midst of an insight that he seems pleased by. And I look like I'm writing down what they've come up with, but I look both pleased and confused that I don't quite understand what I'm working on. And I think that captures our occasional joy and uneasiness as we try to produce this book.
Thank you. Professor Sibony, anything you'd like to add?
I think you can tell we were having fun, and we had a lot of fun in the making of this book. It's not a comic topic. It's actually a very serious topic, but we tried to have some fun in writing it, and we hope that the readers will have some fun in reading it.
Yes, and when and where is it, by the way?
This is in Danny's apartment in New York, where we spent a lot of time. That was, of course, before COVID. We've been working on this project for about 5 years now, and the first 3.5 years were a lot less productive than the last 18 months.
Is that so?
Because once we had to work by Zoom, it became a lot more effective, actually, which is interesting.
Interesting. Yeah. I will actually get back to that, the topic of remote work. But to get started, Cass, why did you feel that you had to write this book? I heard a conversation you had last week with a couple of journalists here in Sweden, and you talked about the meeting with Daniel Kahneman, where he talked about what he referred to as his best idea ever. So what was that about?
Okay, I think Danny is a great friend, and I worked with him a lot in the 1990s. And after thinking fast and slow, I would periodically ask him, what are you working on now? And in one conversation about 5 years ago, maybe, I'm not sure what adjective he used. It was probably, I have a very large idea, or one of my largest ideas. And I felt, probably, it shows you something about psychology, I felt that his enthusiasm, it felt like best, though he wouldn't say that, didn't say that. It was a very large idea. And you could see palpable excitement. And then I saw him about a year after and talked to him about how it's going. And he said he's working with a brilliant French social scientist, Olivier. And he said, we're having great fun, and it's not clear it's going to become a book, but gosh, are we having great fun with this. And after a few conversations about that, I said, a little like the least popular person in high school, can I be invited to your party? And he said, well, why don't you have lunch with us? I wasn't thinking at all about co-authoring. I was thinking about going to a party. And I liked Olivier immediately. We hit it off great. And the excitement of the topic was, to me, electrifying. And I thought there's so many applications in all over, not just business, but government, ordinary life. And there hadn't been a systematic treatment of the subject, which it's fun as well as gripping, I think. And I thought after this discussion, could I not just go to the party? Could I be kind of their friend? Of course, I was Danny's friend already, but their friend meaning co-author. But I was too shy to ask. One doesn't ask the most popular girl in the school if she go out with you. One waits to see how things go. And Danny did write me the next day saying, would you join the project? And that was not a hard question to answer.
And what Cass, in his typical style, is not telling you is that it had become obvious to us that this was too big a topic for a psychologist and a business professor to tackle on their own, and that the societal, legal, philosophical, and political ramifications of the topic of noise had become so important in our minds that we realized we weren't qualified to talk about them without someone like Cass. So it's not just because he's a sexy guy and then he was a pretty girl, which is what he would make it sound like.
Thanks for that. So, Professor Sibony, I know you have prepared some slides. Could you and Cass start with giving our audience some background to the book?
Actually, I really don't want to deluge everybody with PowerPoint slides, but there are a couple of slides that I think illustrate the concept of noise quite effectively, and making the concept visual, which we actually do in the introduction to the book, helps. And here's the slide. Basically, imagine that you've got a team of people who've gone to the shooting range, and they are taking one rifle, and each person on the team shoots, and you look at the target. And here is the result for team A. In team A, there is no error. These people are pretty accurate. They hit the bullseye or pretty close to the bullseye every time. Now, suppose that team B takes another rifle, and the result looks like this. Here, you immediately want to ask, well, hold on, something must be wrong with this rifle. Why would all these people be hitting in the same spot in a very concentrated way, but in the same spot that is not the bullseye? Obviously, there must be something wrong with the way they're aiming or with the way the rifle is shooting. But this, of course, is not what you would expect at a shooting range. This happens. This is a bias. This is what happens when you've got a predictable error of known direction. What is much more frequent in life, and especially at shooting ranges, but also in judgments, is something like this, which is that on average, they're sort of kind of hitting close to the center, except that only one of these 5 guys has hit the bullseye, and all the other ones are all over the place. And this is noise. This is what you have when you don't have a known error of predictable direction, but you still have a lot of error. And of course, you could have both noise and bias. And the point we were trying to make in this book, not about shooting ranges, but about judgments in general, is that whenever we are looking at judgments, there is going to be noise. There is sometimes going to be bias as well, as in the case of team D here. That's actually frequent. But at a minimum, there will always be noise, as in the case of team C, even if there is no bias. And when we say judgments, and I will stop here after this page, when we say judgment, we mean that wherever there is judgment, there is noise, and probably more of it than you think. And what do we mean by judgment? Professional judgments are everywhere where we expect professionals to be making some kind of judgment on which we think that there is a correct answer. When a doctor is looking at your throat and trying to decide what disease you have, we think there's a correct answer. If two doctors disagree, at least one of them must be wrong. When the admissions office of a college is deciding who gets in and who doesn't get in, they're trying very hard to decide who are the best candidates. They assume that there is a correct answer. Now they realize that they might disagree about who is best and who is not quite as good, but they assume there is a correct answer. When you're making a hiring decision, when you are making a judgment in a courtroom, when you are looking at movie scripts and deciding which ones get produced, even when you're looking at fingerprints and you're trying to decide whether they match, you're actually making judgments. In some of these judgments, we expect that there is going to be very little noise, for instance, fingerprints, but there is some. And in some of these judgments, we expect that there is going to be quite a bit of noise, for instance, hiring decision, and there is a lot more than we think there is. And this is the key message of this book. Wherever there is judgment, there is noise, and probably more of it than you think. Then the rest of the book covers how you would actually tackle this problem and what you would do about it, and why it's a problem for businesses, it's a problem for medicine, it's a problem for justice, and it's a problem for all walks of life and all parts of society in general. But rather than give you a long lecture full of PowerPoint slides, let me stop here and just let you ask whatever questions are on your mind, which both Cass and I will be happy to answer.
Thank you so much for giving us all that crash course. And I guess as a former management consultant, the urge to PowerPoint away is
exactly.
Appreciate you hide it well.
I'm a recovering consultant. I'm trying not to repeat my past sins.
You're doing great. You're doing great. So let me get to you, Professor Sunstein. So I believe most of the people in our audience, as Tobias said, we have a fairly behaviorally informed crowd here today. So most of them will be familiar with at least one of your 40 books, and that is Nudge, of course. They tried to translate it, I think, 10 years ago, but it wasn't a huge success, but the English version is a huge success here in Sweden. So Nudge, that has obviously changed how governments and public agencies operate. What effect do you wish for this new book, Noise, to have on how countries are managed?
Well, we have an idea of something called a noise audit, by which you find out how much noise there is. And it's actually really easy to do informally. Just present a bunch of people with a scenario. It might be doctors, it might be public officials. Maybe it's people who are trying to decide whether to give visas for people to visit Sweden. And you ask maybe 20 or 40 or 100 of the people, and you see how much they differ. Once you do a noise audit, you'll often find there's a lot of noise there, as Olivier says, more than you think. And there are two things that are wrong with that. One is unfairness. If a government is treating half of people one way and half of people another way, that's a violation of equal treatment. And also it's the case that if you have noise, you're going to have a lot of mistakes. And they may cause health harm in the case of medicine. They might cause a loss of dollars or whatever currency is operating in a way that would hurt taxpayers. It might lead to a very significant amount of harmful mistakes. So the thought is for governments, as for private sectors, doing a noise audit and finding out how much is there can be a recipe for producing a fairer and a less harm-producing society.
And coming back to Olivier Sibony, your point about when there's judgment, there's noise, and probably more than you think. So I guess a lot of agencies and businesses are in for a shock once they do a noise audit, I guess.
They are. And you know, one of the stories we tell in the book, which is actually from the private sector for a change, is the story of an insurance company in which underwriters and claims adjusters are making professional judgments. And these aren't amateurs. These are people who are applying the rules and the tools of their trade and who have been trained at length to do their job and who have very specialized technical skills. And so the assumption in the insurance company was that when two different underwriters look at the same quote, at the same request from a customer to give them a price to insure a risk, or when two different claims adjusters look at the same claim, of course, we expect that there is going to be some difference. They are not machines. And the reason we call this a matter of judgment is to recognize that different people may differ within reasonable bounds. But when you ask the management of the insurance company, all the underwriters and the claims adjusters themselves, how much do you think you disagree? What would in fact be a tolerable amount of difference? They typically say 10%. And you know, when we've asked this question of hundreds of executives, basically that's the most frequent answer. They say, yeah, when people have a matter of judgment that can be quantified, we expect that two qualified people could disagree by 10%. Now, in this insurance company, the difference was closer to 50%, 5 times larger than people expected. And consistently in domain after domain, we found that people say, yes, of course, we expect there is going to be some disagreement, but the surprise is not that there is disagreement. Of course, in a matter of judgment, there is going to be disagreement. The surprise is that there is a lot more than you think, and a lot more than you think is acceptable or tolerable for purposes of fairness and of reducing errors, as Cass was pointing out. So that is the call to action. That is what we're urging organizations of all kinds to think about. Can you measure noise? Is it in fact as small as you hope, or is it larger than you think? And if it is larger than you think, what are you going to do about it?
Interesting. Yeah. Wow. So I want to touch briefly on the topic of bias. So as we already mentioned, the third author of this book is Daniel Kahneman, of whom most of you in the audience will be familiar with. I'm sure a lot of people have read Thinking Fast and Slow, or at least bought it. It did very well. Tobias from Volante will be sure to tell you. So with Thinking Fast and Slow, the term bias and its implication has sort of gone into something that you used to only talk about when studying behavioral science or cognitive science at the university to a public good of sorts. You hear the term bias a lot these days in the press and in the general conversation. So any thoughts on why the topic of bias has landed so well in the public's perception? And could you perhaps help our audience to give them some advice on how to talk about the topic of noise so that it becomes as well understood as the term bias?
I'm happy to address that. So bias is a little bit like a star performer. It's a little like Elvis Presley or Taylor Swift. Bias is charismatic. Also, bias fits with the human mind's inclination to like stories and causes. So if something goes wrong, you might think, well, they were unrealistically optimistic, or they should suffer from present bias. Or if there's unfairness, you might think there's discrimination on the basis of sex. And that's all very intuitive, and it's satisfying. Noise, by contrast, is a little like a character in a movie to whom no one pays attention, who turns out in the last scene to have been the murderer. Noise can be the villain of the piece, but it's not Taylor Swift noise. I think we're hopeful that that's going to change, just because under current circumstances, the unfairness and costs of that form of error that is noise is so visible once you start looking for it, and turns out to be so intolerable. The idea of noise is, I think, on reflection, intuitive, that if you step on a scale that in the morning shows you as too heavy compared to how you are during the week, but on the weekend it shows you as lighter than you actually are, that's a noisy scale. That's compounding errors, that on the weekend you're a little excited about how little weight you have, how much you've lost, and then during the week you're a little sad, and it's the errors compound. And if you're hiring people or promoting people, or if you're deciding how to handle some terrible problem that your firm or your life or your country faces, and there's a lot of noise, that's arresting, that commands attention once you start focusing on it. Now, the good thing about a lot of work in social science is that it's much better now than it was 10 years ago. And our hope is that this book, which is really a start, by no means the last word, will help spur people to do what a number of people are actually doing, which is to come to terms with the problem of unwanted variability.
There's a small twist on this that I would like to add, which is that bias is very easy to picture as something that happens in individuals, in people. So you can say, this person is biased against women, or that person is biased against Blacks. And that's a very easy story to attribute to a person. Noise, on the other hand, is a property of a system. You can't say a person is noisy, or you can, but it actually misses the main point of the story. An organization is noisy if it has people who operate very differently when they should be operating in a consistent and predictable way. And that's a different type of problem. It's not a problem that each of us faces every day in their daily lives, except as people who are on the receiving end of the decisions of those organizations. But it's a huge problem for organizations, public and private, that are trying to make decisions and to produce accurate results.
That's good. Thank you for adding that.
One little notation, if I may, on that. So Olivier says the principal problem of noise is faced by organizations, all sorts. But there's a funny additional point, which is that each of us might be noisy in the sense that we might, in the afternoon, make a very different judgment from what we do in the morning. And that, which we call occasion noise, is a feature of the human condition. We find it in both medicine and in law, where doctors in the morning might prescribe a lot of medicines or have a lot of tests. In the afternoon, when they're tired, might say, go home and come back if you keep feeling bad. And judges might be very severe if it happens that they're in really bad moods because their favorite sports team lost, or because it's really cold outside, and they might be much more lenient if they're in high spirits. So the principal problem is organizational, but organizations can be adversely affected by noisy individuals.
It's a very hard thing to admit, that you are very susceptible to occasional noise. I'm really cranky in the afternoon. I guess I shouldn't make this decision. Anyway, so when I read this book, it really strikes you that I mean, a lot in life is affected by chance. I mean, you really shines a light on big and small lotteries that happens all the time. But I mean, when I come to think about it, I haven't heard any sort of public outcry against the noise. So will there ever be a public outcry about this lottery affecting so many aspects of our lives?
That's a great question, Niklas. And the answer is we hope there will be, and we hope we contribute to it. We know that there is chance in life, right? We know that there are things that we do not control and that they have a big impact on our destinies. We sort of try to forget it, by the way, and especially when we're successful, we like to believe that it's because of things we did and not because we've been lucky. But, you know, we sort of conceptually know that. We are much less aware of chance in judgments of the lottery in our minds. The occasion noise that Cass was talking about really means that when you made a decision yesterday afternoon, Niklas, and you said, well, I was probably cranky, your decision, which you think of today as being completely determined by the facts that you were looking at, was in fact influenced by some chance factors of which you were not even aware. That's a very hard thing to wrap your mind around. And here's the problem that it raises. When we say a bad decision was caused by bias, that's outrageous. That's a scandal. If the judge sends one defendant to jail for 7 years because the defendant is black and another defendant who is white to only 3 years for exactly the same crime, that's outrageous. I'm going to be out there demonstrating with a sign that says, you know, stop bias injustice, right? If we say one judge was cranky in the afternoon and another judge was in a good mood in the morning because his favorite football team won, and therefore two defendants who are otherwise identical got 7 years and 3 years, we tend to say, well, bad luck, or good luck for the one who got 3 years instead of 7. We don't muster the same kind of outrage. And really, if we step back, why is that? Why is an injustice that is caused by randomness any more acceptable than an injustice that is caused by something we can identify as evil or wicked? I think we should reconsider that assumption, and I think we are trying to raise awareness of the fact that a system that collectively does not guarantee a minimum level of homogeneity in the decisions that its people make is failing the people to whom it has an obligation.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's sort of, it gets easier and easier to put on a sign. I mean, stop the interference of noise in our justice system. It was sort of lengthy before you put the word to it. So anyways, you talked about the process of recruiting and how noise might affect the recruiting process. And I know there's a lot of leaders and managers in our audience. So I sort of want you to, could you share a bit on how noise affects the recruitment process? And if you could give them some advice on how to make their processes less affected by noise.
Well, there's a whole chapter of the book on the topic. And the reason there's a whole chapter is because on recruiting, there is actually a lot of research that has been done that tells us why traditional methods of recruiting, unstructured interviews as they're called, do not work very well, and how to improve them by adding more structure. Without going into all the details, the basic idea is that the more you are going to break down your decision into small pieces, the more you're going to treat those pieces as independent judgments that you need to make separately of each other, the more you're going to have different people independently weighing in on those decisions. And the more you're going to be able to delay your intuitive judgment of a candidate until the end of that process, the better it's going to be. This applies to recruiting. It applies to a lot of other things, by the way, but in recruiting, we happen to have a lot of evidence that it improves the quality of decisions. What is striking about this, by the way, is that this research has been out there for a long time. We didn't discover that structured interviews outperform unstructured interviews, but a lot of people who are in charge of recruiting still have a preference for the good old unstructured method because they trust their judgment and they trust their intuition and they trust their ability to make the decision in the blink of an eye to say, oh, this guy, he's going to be wonderful. This lady, won't be a good fit with the culture of the company. And we know from a ton of evidence that this opens the door to a lot of biases, as in the example I just gave you, but also to a lot of random error in the form of noise. So better structuring of the decisions, more varied, more diverse inputs into the decisions, and a delayed use of intuition basically are the answers to your question.
Thank you so much. Professor Sunstein, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I'd like to add that what Olivier said is extremely generalizable. So the idea in medicine that you take not just one judgment, but several, and the second opinion is often standard in hospitals. And the idea of seeing options as like candidates, where you might have 5 options for a course of action. Think of them as candidates. And if you break them up into pieces rather than just thinking holistically, which do I like, you can do much better. There's in medicine, when an infant is born, there's something in some countries called an Apgar Score, where there are 5 factors that you look at and you rate them all on a scale of 1 to 4. And this is extremely simple. You can do it in business, you can do it in government. And so long as the various things you're scoring are independent from each other, you're going to reduce bias and noise simultaneously. We call it decision hygiene. And the reason we use the word hygiene is that when you're using hygiene, like washing your hands, you're protecting yourself against an assortment. Now there's one particular disease that's salient, but you're protecting yourself against an assortment of diseases, and noise has that characteristic.
Thank you. So soon we will open up for the Q&A from our audience, and I want to remind everyone, please type in your questions to the professors using the chat. You will be spotlighted, but I'm not sure that you will be seen on video. You will only be heard reading your questions. So if you're out strolling or whatever you're doing, we won't show your picture, but you will have to read your question out loud. So 5 more minutes, and then we'll take your questions, which leaves me to take this conversation sort of road. We already touched upon you finishing this book using Zoom, a tool we all are very familiar with. But I'm interested in the role that noise plays when it comes to remote work. We're all very familiar with working remotely, but we haven't talked about noise and remote work. So care to share any thoughts on how noise perhaps affected your work when finishing this book?
Well, it led to greater efficiency and less socializing. So if you're on Zoom, you are focusing on the task at hand rather than on family and lunch. So that's an advantage. In terms of variability in judgment, you're actually asking a deep question about meetings and group decision-making. It's good to have lots of different views in terms of group decision-making. You don't want everyone to think the same thing, and you certainly don't want the leader to say, here's what I think early in a way that gets everyone else to fall in line. I'd say that there is a feature of remote discussion. I've noticed this lately, where for some people at least, it encourages independence of mind in ways that in-person meetings might staunch. It can go the other way, but sometimes in person, you're very alert to who's the most confident, who's the leader, who's the one who can, punish others in one or another way. Sometimes in remote, everyone is more equal. And while in our group, I hope we were all equal in decision making, it was helpful, I think, in forcing us to say what we actually thought in a way that could lead to mutual correcting, maybe in a more efficient way than what would happen when we're in person and thinking a little bit about how wonderful it is to see each other. Danny has a great phrase, which is when you're asking someone for advice, you want someone who likes you, but who doesn't care about your feelings. I think that's brilliant. And it's certainly true when you're thinking about what the right decisions are in context of book production or basically anything. Someone who likes you and cares about your welfare, might be your company's, it might be you as a patient, but who doesn't care about your feelings, meaning they're prepared to give you an answer you don't want to hear.
Thank you. Professor Sibony, anything you'd like to add about this process?
No, I mean, again, to generalize what Cass says, I think remote work, not just about writing a book, but about anything, forces us to introduce more structure in what we're doing, and structure and more discipline in the way we're working. And structure and discipline actually help reduce noise. They make life a little less fun, but they also make judgments a little less noisy. So that maybe, there is nothing we especially like about remote working. We like to meet people in person, but this may be part of the silver lining of remote work.
Thank you. So coming close to our Q&A from the audience, but I went through the attendee list and I noticed that there's a couple of politicians here, a couple of people working at the government, the cabinet. So I want to address you all in bring up your notepad for the gentleman's answers for this last question. So okay, so here's how I think, gentlemen. You both, you work at advisors. You have you advise people in very prestigious domains. It's politicians, it's CEOs, it's business owners. So I think it's fair to say that you're both in a very good place. And I understand you're not looking for a new job, but let's pretend that the government of Sweden gave you a call and asked for your help on a challenge so exciting that you couldn't turn it down. So basically, the government of Sweden would give you an offer you couldn't refuse. What would that offer look like? Perhaps Professor Sibony, why don't you get started?
I have no idea what an offer like this could be. You should ask Cass because he talks to governments all the time. But I have a complete failure of imagination to answer your question, I'm afraid, Niklas.
Sorry about that, but you're closer by, so perhaps we don't need to persuade you as much.
No, I mean, I'm not, to answer you more seriously, I'm actually not in the business of advising anymore. I was a consultant for a long time on a lot of topics, usually not with governments, by the way, exclusively in my case with private companies. And I liked it a lot. The joy of it is to work with people who are much smarter than you are and much more competent than you are, and to try to steer them in the right direction. It's a wonderful job. I would recommend it to anyone who wants to have an influence on the world. It's a great way to have an influence on the world. I've moved on to do something different. I'm trying to do research and teaching now. So that's the answer to your question.
Sorry, everyone. Okay, Professor Sunstein, perhaps better luck. I know you like Stockholm.
Yes, I think.
But what would get you here to help us all?
If there's a nice apartment in Stockholm, I think I'm there in maybe 45 minutes. If the plane can go really fast, and if not so fast, we'll be there tomorrow. Probably not, but
happy to hear. So we gather a bunch of really smart, the best minds in Sweden, and dangle them in front of Professor Sibony. And then we get you a nice apartment, center part of Stockholm. And then we can get you started with whatever, I guess.